I want to thank all the different participants, in particular those who constructed this conference. In a particular way, Dr. Pastel, Father Abraham, Paul Hung, and Father Jose. I'm very grateful for this invitation. I begin this presentation that's called The 5 Agents of the New Populism, echoing many that democracies, contemporary democracies, need to address the new populism and respond to its challenges. They need to do it by a clear, better inclusion of the populist masses that see themselves alienated by those whom they consider the elite in these democracies and whom they want to remove from leadership. I believe that the so-called elite in the leadership of these democracies have a particular responsibility to address the populist masses and to restore a sense of public trust that has increasingly been lost. I come to this presentation not as a political scientist or a sociologist, nor an historian, nor an economist or a law professor. Indeed, these are the usual 5 types of interlocutors broadly conceived of those speaking about populism, whether that populism is new or not. I come as an ethicist. We ethicists, in order to do our work, have to have a wide variety of interlocutors with multiple competencies. For us to do our work, we need the plethora of competencies that are here at this conference. Hopefully, by not coming from within one of the classic forms of investigative inquiry into this topic, I can provide enough of a broad-based keynote so as to provide bridges among your fields. Second, as I began preparing this talk, I began to remember my own social context in which I grew up as a child in Brooklyn, New York. I acknowledge it because when we discuss populism, we need to identify what particular manifestations of populism we are talking about. And I would prefer to discuss these manifestations through the language of agency. I believe that there are roughly 5 different groups of agents involved in the new populism, and that in fact each of the agents have different purposes. I shall speak of the 5 groups as the populist mass, the populist leader, the wealthy populist supporters, the political parties and other cultural and social leaders, and the so-called rejected elite, or the democratic political leaders. Third, I will conclude arguing that the 5th group, the perceived elites of contemporary democracies, need to restore confidence in social trust by directly engaging the populist masses. That is the 1st group. This is not easy because the contempt of the populist mass is rooted in resentfulness over how the elites perceived them in the first place. While classically, populism has been defined as an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into 2 homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people, I believe that there are not 2 groups, but 5. And like others, I am not sure it is right to call populism an ideology, but much prefer to discuss the different ways it frames discourse. I turn now to the 1st group by telling you a little about my past so as to distinguish the populist mass from the other agents in populism. Let me say at the outset, I do not speak with pride or righteousness about my past and all its evident racist, nativist, and misogynistic biases. Rather, I try to convey the insularity, the tribalism, and resentfulness that was so implicit in the culture that I grew up in, as well as the moral innocence by which we did not think of ourselves as biased. Rather, we thought of the elite as biased in their condescending disdain of us. I grew up in a very Irish Catholic neighborhood in Brooklyn in the 1950s. We were working class, children of 3 or 4 generations of Irish American immigrants. We were profoundly suspicious of the Democratic Party. And viewed it as the elite. I do not know why we were so suspicious, but we were. We were trained to understand that the elite was selling us out. In 1960, though 80% of Catholics in the United States voted for the Democrat, John Kennedy, No one in my neighborhood did. We all voted for the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. We did not vote for Kennedy because he was Catholic, but because he was a Democrat. Though I was only 9 years old, I remember distinctly the day that Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt died in 1962. Though the New York Times said that she was, quote, almost universally admired, in my neighborhoods, she was so vilified that we had a celebration with our neighbors because of her death. I am sure she was derided because of her active support of the civil rights movement for African Americans and because she was an independent woman agent. But we were against her not because we thought of ourselves as racist. We didn't, though I now know without a doubt we were, but mostly because she belonged to the elite. She was more interested in others, in this case, African Americans, than us. She welcomed them into her hierarchy, but not us. We were not welcome into her hierarchy. In 1964, my parents and their neighbors all voted for Barry Goldwater for president. And though Goldwater only carried 36% of the vote, and 6 of the 50 states in the United States, with arguably the greatest presidential loss ever in the 20th century, no one in my neighborhood thought we were mistaken in our choice. Though his election was a colossal failure, it was effectively the pathway to electing Donald Trump later. As the Washington Post noted in Goldwater's obituary, in 1998, Goldwater stole the Republican Party from the northeastern elite of the United States and paved the way for Ronald Reagan to become the populist president in 1981 to 1989. Goldwater in 1964 was father to the Reagan developments of 1980, which led to Trump in 2017. The populists of today were a long time in the making. In my populist neighborhood in Brooklyn, we were completely insular in our self-understanding. We thought of ourselves as abandoned by the Democratic Party and that their members as elites were not interested in us. If Hillary Clinton were to have met us at our toast to the dead Mrs. Roosevelt, she would have called us then, in 1962, what she called other populists in 2016 in her campaign for the presidency, the phrase, the deplorables. Clinton's deplorable comment was so remarkably politically stupid. When the elites respond to populists with taunts like that, they only further erode the public trust which populists believe themselves to be alienated from. Subsequently, Clinton became more vilified than anyone in populist America. Like today, back in Brooklyn in the 1960s, we rejected others' assessments of us. While others thought we were racist, backward, exclusivist, or the not yet spoken deplorables, we thought that they called us that simply to justify their disdain of us. They abandoned us, not we them. This group that I just described is one of the agents in populism, usually a working class or some lower class group of people who weave resentful narratives of social abandonment by the elites. As populists, our anger was not over economics per se, but rather the elite's social exclusion of us. We wanted them out of office for their perceived condescension. Resentfulness governs the populist mass. Indeed, in the literature on populism, the language of resentfulness emerges particularly when talking about the alienated ones. That literature came out in a torrent after it appeared in Foreign Policy in 2019, referring to the populist movement as a resentment epidemic. Since then, many writers talk about the specific vice of resentment and its function within this community of actors. When I conclude this presentation, I will advance social trust as a key issue for right resolution, but social trust must work through the long-standing resentfulness in those populist masses that perceive themselves as the deplorables of the elite. The second agent in populism is the leader. I believe that Bart is completely right when he refers to populism as a discursive frame. He states that framing is the practice of presenting an issue from a particular perspective in order to maximize its resonance with a given audience. Populism thus becomes a strategic tool selected based on context, with the latter consisting of the characteristics of the audience, the speaker's own political background and career aspirations, and the political position of the speaker and his or her party. I want to distinguish, however, the populist leader from the populist mass. The populist leader taps into and articulates the grounds for the resentfulness for first casting him or herself as also rejected or as contemptible by the elite. Though the leader does not belong to the populist mass, she or he does give voice to their lament and cry for recognition. Indeed, Bonakowski suggests that populist leaders, the longer they stay in office, the less inclined they are to invoke the populist lament, because they have set the frame for their own ascendancy rather than the masses' needs for true incorporation. It is important to appreciate, however, that regardless of how opportunistic this second agent is, their role in populism is that it is they, and not the populist mass themselves, that articulated the populist mass understanding of the situation. The leader taps into an unarticulated resentfulness and gives it voice by identifying the elite as the source of the resentfulness. Trump and Reagan both did that in the United States. The working class populists were not the leaders of their movement. I think the elites would do well to look sympathetically on the rhetoric of the populist leader, not to validate the populist's own opportunistic ego, nor their agenda, but rather to understand why the populist leader is so able to socially connect with a long experienced alienated population. The elite need to ask, how did Trump, for instance, connect with the people and ignite their passions when they couldn't do it themselves? These questions of the rhetorical resonance of the populist leader, so frequently dismissed by the elite, need to be studied by the elite. I imagine this inability for the elite to recognize this talent of the populist leader is not only found in the US, but elsewhere. Hopefully, this conference will consider well the success of the popular leader as an indictment for the neglect of the elite. The third agent is the wealthy. In a very provocative essay by Amy Chua entitled How Billionaires Learn to Love Populism, Chua discusses billionaire populism, noting that Trump appointed the wealthiest cabinet in modern history. I do not know how well Bolsonaro, Orban, Duterte, or other populist leaders made wealthy allies so integral to their populist discourse, but at least in the United States, this affiliation is key. Effectively, when it came to taxes, Trump was and remains very much a friend of the very wealthy. Chua adds that in affiliating himself with the people, that is, those whom I have described as the populist mass, who have long been unrecognized, that Trump has done, she writes, a remarkable job presenting himself as being on their team, creating a tribal bond between a celebrity billionaire and blue-collar voters. Chua explains the way that many Americans see Trump as the American dream manifest. As she noted, the tribal instinct is all about identification. For many lower-income Americans, being anti-establishment is not the same as being anti-rich. This is the key to the new billionaire populism, and its roots lie deep in American history. I wonder whether it is found elsewhere. These billionaires helped Trump mount an enormous war chest in his campaign for re-election that the populist masses could never have afforded. Trump could not have succeeded without these billionaires, and he used them to create basically a regime that could afford being unaccountable. The billionaires have no real interest in the populist masses, except to the point that they enjoyed the populist masses' power in electing and supporting Trump. Trump and I imagine other populist leaders understood not only their need for the populist masses, but also his need for financial supporters of incredible wealth. Though populists like Trump, before Trump, like Chavez, for instance, targeted the rich, I would be very curious in knowing Which other populists cultivated the wealthy so successfully without alienating the leaders' power base? The fourth group are the political parties and religious, social, and cultural leaders who use the populist leader and the leader's populist mass for their own gain. Unlike the populist masses who have developed the resentful discourse autobiography of being alienated, and the populist leader, generally new to the scene, who uses the first toward her or his populist gains, this group is made up of leaders of aged, long-standing social and cultural institutions that these leaders compromise the identity of their institutions so as to profit from the contemporary populist surge. In my country, the Republican Party, once called the Party of Abraham Lincoln, and a major sector of both the Evangelical Church and the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, together gave a sense of civic legitimacy to Donald Trump and were notably silent when he attempted to launch a coup against our government on January 6th. Unlike the wealthy, whose own self-gain is the same motive that the populist leader has, this group of agents, by compromising their cultural and social institutions by their own parasitic relationship with the populist leader, harmed the body politic and the social trust necessary for society. Long after the populist leader will lose power, the effects of compromise by these leaders need to be redressed through the process of restoring social trust. If these social institutions are to survive into the future, they will eventually need to repudiate the actions of their present leaders who so compromise their mission identity by their cultural support and momentary legitimation of the populist leader. Finally, the fifth group is the elite themselves. Often enough, inasmuch as the other four agents use their discourses to remove or overthrow the legitimacy of the elite in contemporary democracies, the elite in government are often not considered agents in populist affairs. But as I tried to show from the beginning, their negligence and sometimes their actual contempt to further demoralize the populace contribute to the legitimacy of the populist movement. For this reason, I insist that they are agents in the populist movement. They are in part responsible for the original non-recognition of what emerged as a populist movement. I do not want to say that those who belong to the populist masses are truly the abandoned masses. Indeed, I think that they, like the elite, are similar in one respect. They both consider themselves victims, and they acquit themselves of any moral wrongdoing. This is a problem. Indeed, I think the elite have overlooked many of their maintenance of democracies and their evident hierarchies. But often their agency, their causative role in the development of the populist claims go unacknowledged. No less than Nancy Fraser, however, rightly takes them to task. In a recent interview, she said, "I am not unhappy that those who have been screwed by progressive neoliberalism are rising up against it. In some cases, of course, the form of their rebellion takes is problematic. Scapegoating immigrants, Muslims, blacks, Jews, and others. They have often mistaken the true cause of their troubles. But it is counterproductive to simply dismiss them as irredeemable racists and Islamophobes. To assume that at the outset is to surrender any possibility of winning them to the other side. My point," she says, "is that these voters and others have legitimate grievances against progressive neoliberalism. In particular, she criticizes the social hierarchy that the elite are often espousing when, as she notes, they lack even the slightest idea of a structural transformation or an alternative political economy. Far from seeking to abolish social hierarchy, these elites, their whole mindset is aimed at getting more women, gays, people of color into its top ranks. Certainly in the US, but also elsewhere, they have been colonized by this liberalism. I believe that the real issue in the new populism is not the agency of the populist leaders, nor of the wealthy, nor of the parasitic backers, none of whom have any real interest in the common good or any notion of fairness. I believe rather that the elite governors of our democracies need to become reconciled with the populist masses by working to eliminate the social hierarchies that they continue to develop, as Fraser notes. I believe, too, that they need to directly engage the populist masses, confront their narratives of resentfulness with constructive engagements to together repair the social trust of our institutions that are so terribly tattered. Though there are, as I see it, five different agents in the new populism, I think the only ones who are really interested in the good of governance and the good of the common good are, in fact, the populist masses and the elite in the government. They need to engage one another directly by eliminating social hierarchies, and we need to help them in this conference build that bridge. Thank you.